Okay, so we left off with territorial expansion and the economic changes taking place in the beginning of 1830s to 1860s. You have this expansion westward where by 1850 we are all the way to the Pacific coast and it is all American territory. And you have this expansion of technology like railroads and steamships and stuff like that, making travel much more fast and accessible than it had been before. But now we're going to see the problems arising in our union. So now you have conflict over territories, and this is where the free soil movement comes from. Last presentation, we talked about the free soil political party. Well, now we're going to see the origins of that political party. So Northern Democrats and Whigs supported the Wilmot Proviso and that all African Americans should be excluded from the Mexican Cession. They wanted the West for whites only, not abolition in the South. Northerners organized the Free Soil Party in 1848 with the slogan Free Soil, Free Labor, and Free Men. Their main objective was to prevent the extension of slavery, and they advocated for free homesteads, which were public land grants to small farmers, and internal improvements. The Southern view was that most whites viewed any attempts to restrict the expansion of slavery as a violation of their constitutional rights to take and use their property as they wished. They saw free soilers as intent on the ultimate destruction of slavery, and this compromise, known as popular sovereignty, came about when Lewis Cass, a Democratic senator from Michigan, proposed the compromise that soon won a lot of support from both moderate Northerners and moderate Southerners, that people who settled in a territory could vote on whether or not they wanted slavery, known as popular sovereignty. So in the election of 1848, there are three political parties. You have the Whigs, the Democrats, and the Free Soil Party. The Democrats nominated a senator from Michigan and adopted a platform of popular sovereignty. They nominated Cass. The Whigs nominated a Mexican war hero, General Zachary Taylor, who had never been involved in politics, and he took no position on slavery in the territories. And then the Whig Taylor was a Southern slaveholder. The Free Soil Party nominated Van Buren as the conscience Whigs. They were opposed to slavery, and anti-slavery Democrats got together as the Free Soil Party. And ultimately, you have Taylor winning. So you have a Whig president, and this is the start of the end of the Whig Party because you have this division into the Free Soil Party. In 1849, there's the gold rush of 1849, where gold was found in California. And there's an influx of about 100,000 settlers into California to get rich quick off of gold. This is why also the name of the San Francisco 49ers football team, it's named the 49ers after the 1849 gold rush. So as we go through, we're going to see a lot of football teams named over the next 50 years, or not named, but their names come from the history over the next 50 or so years. In 1849, California drafted a state constitution that banned slavery. President Taylor supported California and New Mexico both entering as free states. New Mexico wasn't a huge fan of that. So Henry Clay proposed a compromise to soothe the angry Southerners. Daniel Webster of Massachusetts argued for compromise in order to save the Union, and in doing so alienated the Massachusetts abolitionists who formed the base of his support. John C. Calhoun of South Carolina argued against the compromise and insisted that the South be given equal rights in the acquired territory. So, in 1850, Zachary Taylor suddenly died and was replaced by his vice president, Millard Fillmore. Stephen A. Douglas from Illinois engineered coalitions to pass each part of the compromise separately. So they admitted California to the Union as a free state, divide the remainder of the Mexican Cession into two different territories, the Utah Territory and New Mexico Territory, and allow the settlers in these territories to decide the slavery issue by popular sovereignty. Then they wanted to give the land in dispute between Texas and New Mexico Territory to the new territories in return for the federal government assuming Texas's public debt of $10 million from the Mexican-American War. They also wanted to ban the slave trade in the District of Columbia, but they said they would continue to permit whites to hold slaves there. And They wanted to adopt a new fugitive slave law and enforce it rigorously. So the North said that this was adding to their power because California was admitted as a free state, but the Fugitive Slave Law gave further power to the South to keep their slaves. So if you look at the map here, you can see Compromise of 1850. The free states and territories are the green, the orange was popular sovereignty, and blue was slave states. So the Fugitive Slave Law, its purpose was to track down runaway or fugitive slaves who escaped to a northern state, allowed them to be captured, and then they were returned to their southern owners. This placed fugitive slave cases under the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government instead of state governments, and it authorized special U.S. commissioners to issue warrants to arrest the fugitives. Captured prisoners who claimed to be free African Americans and not runaway slaves were denied the right of trial by jury. It was basically like if they got caught, if they couldn't prove it right away, then they were being taken back into slavery. Citizens who attempted to hide a runaway or to obstruct enforcement of the law were subject to heavy penalties. So the North hated this law because they didn't want to send people back, and the South agreed to the Compromise of 1850 because of this law. So the Fugitive Slave Law was wrapped into the Compromise of 1850. You can see here multiple banners for the Fugitive Slave Law, political cartoons regarding the Fugitive Slave Law. Again, the North was very unhappy about it, and the South was on high alert. So now you see the rise of the Underground Railroad, which is this loose network of Northern free blacks and courageous ex-slaves with the help of some white abolitionists. They helped escaped slaves reach freedom in the North or in Canada. The most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. She made at least 19 trips into the South to help about 300 slaves escape. So free blacks in the North and abolitionists also organized vigilance committees to protect fugitive slaves from slave catchers. And once the Civil War broke out, African American leaders like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and Sojourner Truth continued to work for the emancipation of slaves and to support black soldiers in the Union cause. This map shows multiple routes for the Underground Railroad. Conductors were leaders of the escape. Passengers were escaping slaves. The tracks were the routes. Trains were farm wagons transporting the escaping slaves. And depots were safe houses to rest and sleep. So they even had railroad terminology in the Underground Railroad. Books on slavery during this time period included Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was a novel about the conflict between an enslaved man named Tom and the brutal white slave owner Simon Legree. It was written in 1852 by Northern writer Harriet Beecher Stowe. Northerners and Europeans regarded slavery as monstrously cruel and inhumane because of this book, and Southerners condemned the untruths in the novel and saw it as proof of Northern prejudice. Ultimately, Lincoln, when he met Harriet Beecher Stowe, said, quote, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." Another major book on slavery was The Impending Crisis of the South, written in 1857 by Hinton Our Helper. He attacked slavery, saying that the slavery weakened the South's economy. And the book ultimately was banned in the South, but widely distributed in the North. So it attacked slavery differently than Harriet Beecher Stowe did, but it still attacked slavery. So if you look at the free states versus the slave states in the 1850s, there was much more population in the free states, and more patents for inventions, more value in their church buildings, more newspapers, periodicals, which goes along with the fact that they were higher educated, or more people were more educated and more literate. Bank capital was over double what the slave states had, and the value of exports was much greater in the free states as well. And this was part of Hinton Our Helper's argument that slavery actually hurts the economy. So the Southern reaction to these books was that they argued slavery was a positive good for the slave and the master alike. It was sanctioned by the Bible and was firmly grounded in philosophy and history. It contrasted with the conditions of Northern wage workers, who the Southerners called wage slaves, with familial bonds that could develop on plantations between master and slave, making it a more positive relationship. George Fitzhugh wrote The Sociology for the South and Cannibals All, which said that the capitalist wage system was worse than slavery. So it's all about that perspective. In the election of 1852, the Whig Party was in trouble. The Whigs nominated another military hero of the Mexican War, General Winfield Scott, and concentrated on their plans for improving roads and harbors and trying to ignore the sectional issues of slavery. The Democrats nominated Franklin Pierce of New Hampshire. He was acceptable to the South because he supported the Fugitive Slave Law. So you can see Pierce won 86% of the electoral vote. So again, Democratic won this election. The next act or compromise was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois wanted to build a railroad and promote Western settlement, but he needed Southern approval for it. So he introduced a bill to divide the Nebraska Territory into two parts, the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory. And he wanted to say that settlers in each were able to decide whether or not to allow slavery, called popular sovereignty, and that both territories north of the 3630 line gave Southerners an opportunity to expand slavery where it had been previously denied by the Missouri Compromise. So if you look at the map, you can see the red states are allowed slavery, open to slavery now due to the Kansas-Nebraska Act in orange. The green line shows you where the Missouri Compromise line was. So this opens a large amount of territory to the possibly slave-owning people. As a result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, you have Bleeding Kansas, where slaveholders in Missouri set up homesteads in Kansas simply to win control of the territory for the South. Northern abolitionists and the Free Soilers organized the New England Emigrant Aid Company in 1855, which paid for the transportation of anti-slavery settlers over to Kansas. As you can imagine, fighting broke out between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups. Pro-slavery Missourians, mockingly called border ruffians by their enemies, crossed over the border to create pro-slavery legislature in Lecompton, Kansas. The anti-slavery settlers refused to recognize the government and created their own legislature in Topeka. So in 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked a free soil town of Lawrence, Kansas, which killed 2 and destroyed many homes and businesses. 2 days later, John Brown, who was an abolitionist, attacked. He and his sons attacked a pro-slavery farm settlement at Pottawatomie Creek, which killed 5 settlers. So you can see Bleeding Kansas depicted in that political cartoon. And in the map below, you can see where Topeka, Lecompton, and Lawrence and Pottawatomie all existed in the Kansas Territory, not too far from Missouri. President Pierce remained aloof from the turmoil in Kansas. He did nothing to keep the elections fair and keep people from just moving in to vote. The Democratic Party got even more divided between the Northern and Southern factions by the Bleeding Kansas issue. The violence also spilled into Congress. In 1856, Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner verbally attacked the Democratic administration in a speech, "The Crime Against Kansas." He included a lot of personal charges against South Carolina's Andrew Butler. Butler wasn't there, but he was defended by his nephew, who walked into the Senate chamber and beat Sumner over the head with a cane. Sumner never fully recovered from the attack. Butler later explained that dueling was too good for Sumner, but a cane was fit for a dog. So politics back then was a little more rough than it is today, although you still have a lot of divisiveness. The North was outraged and the South applauded Brooks's deed. So you have this awful situation of politics and words leading to violence, not only in Kansas, but in Congress. So now new political parties were created as the Whig Party kind of fell apart and the Democrats were struggling. You have the Know Nothing Party, where party members often responded, "I know nothing," to political questions. Officially, their name was the American Party, but they were known as the Know Nothing Party. They came out of ethnic tension in the North between native-born Protestant Americans and immigrant Germans and Irish Catholics. Often, native-born Protestant Americans in the North were called WASPs, White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. The Know Nothing Party drew support away from the Whigs, and they were opposed to the Catholics and immigrants that were entering northern cities in large numbers. They quickly fell out of influence. They were a brief political party for maybe 10, 15 years at most. Then the Republican Party rose out. They were founded in Wisconsin in 1854 as a direct result of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It was a coalition of free soilers and anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats. They opposed the spread of slavery in the territories, but they didn't want to end slavery itself. And it quickly became the second largest party in the country. In the election of 1856, the Republicans nominated young explorer John Fremont. He believed in no expansion of slavery, free homesteads, and a pro-business protective tariff. The Know Nothings competed strongly with Millard Fillmore, and the Democrats nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania, distancing themselves from President Pierce and Stephen Douglas because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Buchanan ended up winning, so the Democrat candidate won again. A major constitutional issue of the era, Kansas tried to propose a state constitution in 1857 that was pro-slavery. It was rejected by Congress. This is known as the Lecompton Constitution. The Supreme Court got involved with slavery in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case of 1857. Scott was a slave, and he was held in Missouri and then taken to free territory in Wisconsin, where he lived for 2 years before being returned to Missouri. He argued that his living on free soil made him a free citizen, so he sued for his freedom in Missouri in 1846. Chief Justice Roger Taney, who was a Southern Democrat, he decided ultimately against Scott. He said that Scott had no right to sue in a federal court because the framers of the Constitution did not intend African Americans to ever be U.S. citizens. Congress did not have the power to deprive any person of property without due process of the law, and since slaves were a form of property, and Congress couldn't exclude them from any federal territory. Therefore, also, the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it excluded slavery from Wisconsin and other northern territories through the Missouri Compromise and any act that said it was illegal. So the court's ruling absolutely delighted Southern Democrats and absolutely infuriated Northern Republicans. Effectively, the Supreme Court declared that all parts of the Western territories were open to slavery, and you can imagine how angry the Northern Republicans and just Northerners were about that. So Abraham Lincoln started to rise during the 1850s. Democrat Stephen Douglas in Illinois was fighting for re-election as Illinois senator against young Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was not an abolitionist, but he was a moderate, and he was against the expansion of slavery. So the Lincoln-Douglas debates were 7 campaign debates held in different Illinois towns. Douglas ultimately won the re-election, but lost ground by alienating the Southern Democrats because he wouldn't stand up enough for the Dred Scott decision. Lincoln ultimately emerged from this as a national figure and a major contender for president in 1860. Lincoln gave a speech known as the House Divided Speech, and in it he said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." He also said this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free, and he was not wrong. John Brown, in October of 1859, tried to start a slave uprising in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He included his 4 sons and some former slaves in an attack on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They wanted to use the guns from the arsenals to arm Virginia's slaves, whom he expected to rise up in general revolt. Robert E. Lee had to lead federal troops to capture Brown and his band after a 2-day siege. Brown and his six of his followers were tried for treason, they were convicted, and they were hanged by the state of Virginia. Moderates in the North condemned Brown's use of violence. Southerners weren't convinced by the moderates. And Southern whites saw the raid as final proof of the North's true intentions, to use slave revolts to destroy the South. And Brown was ultimately viewed as a martyr by many anti-slavery Northerners because he spoke with simple eloquence at his trial of his humanitarian motives in wanting to free the slaves. So you can see the John Brown siege, and that is an image of John Brown in the bottom right. In the election of 1860, the Democratic Party started to break up due to sectional differences. They held a convention in Charleston, South Carolina, and a convention in Baltimore, Maryland, which brought forth two different candidates, Douglas and Breckinridge. The Northern platform was of popular sovereignty and the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law. The Southern platform was one of unrestricted extension of slavery in the territory and the annexation of Cuba, where slavery was already flourishing. So they still haven't given up on that whole Cuba idea. The Republicans nominated Lincoln, whose platform of protective tariffs for industry, free land for homesteaders, and internal improvements to encourage Western settlement, including a railroad to the Pacific. In the South, secessionists warned that if Lincoln won presidency, their states would leave the Union. A fourth political party, the Constitutional Union Party, which was comprised of former Whigs, Know-Nothings, and moderate Democrats, nominated John Bell of Tennessee with a platform of pledging the enforcement of the laws and the Constitution and preserving the Union above all. The two Democratic candidates got more popular votes than Lincoln, but because they were a separate ticket, they lost. So Lincoln ultimately won the election of 1860. But think how close we possibly came to never having Lincoln. So with the election of Lincoln, it sealed the deal for secession. In December of 1860, a special convention was held in South Carolina, and at it they voted unanimously to secede from the Union. So from December to 1860 to January 1861, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas voted to secede from the Union. And in February of 1861, representatives of those 7 states of the Deep South met in Montgomery, Alabama, and created the Confederate States of America. Southern whites who voted for secession believed that they were acting in the tradition of the Revolution of 1776. They argued that they had a right to national independence and to dissolve a constitutional compact that no longer protected them from the tyranny of Northern rule. Many of them also thought that Lincoln, like Buchanan, might permit secession without a fight. The Confederate States of America established a constitution very similar to that of the U.S. Constitution. It restricted the government's power to impose tariffs and to restrict slavery. And they elected president and vice president at the convention. So president was Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, and vice president was Alexander Stephens of Georgia. So above you have a picture of Jefferson Davis, and below on the right you have Alexander Stephens. Jefferson Davis was a member of the Democratic Party, and he represented Mississippi in both the House and the Senate. He also was the U.S. Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce from 1853 to 1857. Unfortunately for Davis, he had poor leadership during the war. He was reluctant to delegate tasks. He lacked a lot of popular appeal. He played a lot of favorites towards his old friends, and he neglected civil matters in favor of military matters, which ultimately caused a lot of people to turn against him. So all of these things kind of folded together to make it so that he was unpopular. Buchanan had 5 months in office before Lincoln ultimately would succeed him. Buchanan was conservative and did nothing to stop the secession. Congress wanted to appease the South, so Senator John Crittenden of Kentucky proposed a constitutional amendment that would guarantee the right to hold slaves in all territories south of 3630. Lincoln said he would not accept this compromise because it violated the Republican position against the extension of slavery into the territories. So ultimately, the causes of the Civil War were sectional disagreements and debates over tariffs, the extension of slavery into the territories, and the nature of the Union, also known as states' rights. Northern abolitionists went against Southern defenders of slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin really pushed people into becoming abolitionists and hating the ills of slavery. The U.S. Supreme Court decision in the Dred Scott case really incensed a lot of people. And there was a series of the failed compromises, the Missouri Compromise, Compromise of 1850, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, over the expansion of slavery and the Fugitive Slave Act, all bundled up together, caused the Civil War.